Thank you. Hi, I'm Nina. I'm a senior technical product manager at Indeed, and I'm currently working on making it easier for our external developers to consume Indeed's APIs. But before that, I spent 2 years on our OneGraph migration, leading the adoption of our subgraph in our employer-focused product.
And I'm Mike Cohen. I'm a technical fellow at Indeed. I've spent a lot of my time at Indeed focusing on our API platform. I currently lead the architecture for our customer identity and access management group.
So we're here to tell you about how we built OneGraph, Indeed's federated GraphQL solution, and what we learned along the way. But to get started, we want to tell you a little bit about Indeed. Our mission at Indeed is to help people get jobs. And to do that, we build a few products for different types of users. First, we help job seekers get offers through our job seeker-focused experiences on web and mobile. This is the product that most people probably think of when they think of Indeed. We also help employers get hires. We have a large employer-facing product to help businesses, from small startups to large enterprises, manage their jobs, applicants, interviews, and much more. And lastly, we help partners power their businesses. We partner with hundreds of companies in the hiring space to power unique experiences off Indeed, using our API capabilities. All of these experiences are powered by our supergraph, which we've named OneGraph. Our architecture today looks something like this. Quick heads up, get ready to be very tired of this diagram by the end of this talk. We'll be coming back to it a lot. So over the years, OneGraph has grown quite large. Today, we have almost 300 subgraphs running in production, owned by more than 200 teams, and our supergraph processes 3.3 million requests per minute globally. But obviously, this is not where we started, so I'll hand it over to Mike to kick off our origin story.
About 5 or 6 years ago, I'd say we had really no API strategy. That really, we had a very, very fragmented API landscape. This picture doesn't really do justice to just how bad it was. We had duplication across the company, often many times over. Standards were inconsistent, protocols, security practices, is very different from team to team generally. It was hard to find APIs. You couldn't go to a central place to look for an API. You had to sort of ask around and find one and hope to find a team that would give you access to the API that you needed. And because of this, and because teams really didn't focus on building for reuse, there was very, very little reuse across the company. And as we saw these problems, it became clear that we needed to do something. We needed to make improvements in this area. At the time, we were organized into 2 business units, job seeker and employer, both sides of our marketplace. And leadership recognized the problems enough that we were able to convince the organization that we needed to establish a couple of teams to help. So we created API platform teams in each of these orgs to chase after some of these problems. And a pretty consistent vision emerged across the company. The first thing that we recognized we wanted was centralized discovery. We wanted teams to be able to go to some centralized place and find APIs and understand how to use those APIs. We wanted consistency. We didn't want developers who approached APIs to feel like there were 50 or 100 different standards that these APIs were built against. We wanted reusability. We wanted to create an environment where teams could build for reusability. And we wanted to provide a strong developer experience. We wanted to make it so it was easy and even enjoyable to build and consume APIs at Indeed. And then finally, we knew we wanted security and compliance built in. We wanted security and compliance practices to be standard and automatic where possible. So like all great software companies, we built it twice. In the employer business unit, we created, the team there created what's known as Employer Graph. It was built actually using Atlassian Braid, which follows like a schema stitching, centralized type of approach. On the job seeker side, we created what we call Job Seeker Federator. Yes, an engineer did pick that name. And this was based on Apollo Federation. So at this time, we had evidence that we clearly saw the problems. We demonstrated those problems to leadership, and we talked with them about how we wanted to address them. And we had enough buy-in to make small investments. And at this point, that's what I'd call this. We made some small investments to create really very nascent API platforms. And interestingly, at this time, the job seeker team reached out to the employer team and tried to get them to combine forces, because like all good engineers, duplication seems bad, but it wasn't a good time. Neither solution was proven, and it was just untenable at the time.
But we did start seeing some wins in both groups. So while testing these solutions, we saw that API developers could now easily reuse and extend capabilities while retaining their autonomy. We also saw that finding APIs that were available became much, much easier. And we saw a decoupling of services because the composed graph allowed subgraphs to evolve independently. We also saw an improved developer experience for both subgraph owners and client-side developers. This quote up here highlights one example of how the front-end developer experience in particular got better during this time. At Indeed, our web applications are largely built with a micro front-end architecture, and before we used subgraphs in the Apollo client library, sharing data in the front end required a lot of manually wrangling code in Redux stores, and it often resulted in teams overfetching for common data because they tended to feel safer requesting exactly what they needed from an API rather than coordinating with a different component in the UI that was subject to an async loading process. But with the shift to the composed GraphQL gateways and a shared client-side cache, our data was much simpler to fetch and reuse, and this really did simplify our client-side development experience.
So as teams began to get on board to these two platforms, leadership started to believe that there was some merit in the solutions we were pursuing. And on the job seeker side, in the fall of 2019, we published a memo that set two really important expectations for that part of the organization. The first was that as you develop new capabilities, you should build APIs with reuse in view, and not just internal reuse, but also external reuse eventually. The second expectation here was that those capabilities should be delivered through Job Seeker Federator, our GraphQL Federation platform in the Job Seeker org. And so as a result of that sort of early leadership buy-in, and given we were well positioned with this platform that had a number of APIs behind it, we were able to onboard Glassdoor as our first major customer. Glassdoor and Indeed, external customer. Glassdoor and Indeed are sister companies. And so at this time, Glassdoor began pursuing leveraging Indeed's job search and matching capabilities, which is an Indeed core competency. And this is what that looked like. So you can kind of see the platform start to emerge. We've got some Indeed teams internally and externally using our federation platform on the job seeker side. By the fall of 21, maybe about a year later, we were serving about 3.5 billion requests per month through the platform. And so we had this we had this platform that was, proven to be reliable, scalable on the job seeker side. The employer side, we also started to see some adoption during this phase. Teams were onboarding onto this platform, and leadership on that side began to see the merits of the solution, especially given the success of onboarding Glassdoor and the growth of that platform.
So now we're in 2021. We had 2 working GraphQL gateway solutions split across our 2 major business areas. However, Indeed has a lot of data models that sit at the intersection of that marketplace. These are things like messages, interviews, and public job details. And we are building 2 versions of these APIs, one supporting Apollo Federation and one supporting Atlassian Braid. And we wanted to keep these experiences connected and prevent divergence in the future. So we really needed to settle on one of these 2 technologies. When comparing our 2 graphs, our job seeker federator, name aside, had advantages over employer graph. First, the use of Apollo Federation's schema registry ensured better safety and validation of changes before deployment. Our job seeker federator had already handled higher production traffic at that point and had onboarded an external client, so it was much more proven and reliable in a high-scale environments, and we trusted the battle readiness of it. And lastly, unlike the employer graph centralized schema stitching, the job seeker federator's decentralized approach allowed for more flexibility in extending types across teams, which ultimately also allowed for more autonomy within our product teams. So because of these advantages, in the fall of 2021, the employer organization decided to move to Apollo Federation over schema stitching. This decision was accompanied with a leadership mandate to migrate all APIs used by the employer experience layer to OneGraph. When we gained our leadership support, our business was strong, leadership wanted to invest in the future by building out our platform technology, and we're ready for this major migration. But this did kick off a timeline for us. We really only had about 2 years to make this migration happen, or we'd risk losing that support and momentum from our leadership team. So this entered us into an interesting phase where we had to start focusing on getting into the graph and couldn't quite be perfectionists about every single subgraph. So now with the company leadership fully supportive of an Apollo federated solution for all core APIs, we actually forked the job seeker federator to establish a new service. This new service is OneGraph and would power experiences across the entire company. This meant that all pre-existing GraphQL subgraphs needed to be moved to OneGraph, which of course is a little bit easier for our job seeker teams, and all pre-existing REST APIs needed to be converted to GraphQL and eventually decommissioned. Also, with our alignment on the technical solution, our leadership also made some organizational changes. To better support this new approach, we established a core API platform team that oversaw the OneGraph infrastructure across the entire company. We also established a GraphQL guild, which set company-wide best practices and recommendations and owned some common developer tooling. These are things like linters. And then in addition to these broadly scoped teams that sat across the company, we did still keep our API platform teams in both our job seeker and employer organizations. These teams now were responsible for helping their product teams in their own spaces successfully transition to the graph. Often, they did still contribute to company-wide strategy and technology, but their primary charters were really focused on their specific organizations moving to the graph.
So in 2021, we were pretty well positioned to expand the platform. We had alignment across the company. We had job seeker and employer subgraphs behind OneGraph, and the platform was proven. We had scaled it to support the needs of Glassdoor and others. So a lot of work was behind us, but we still had quite a bit of work ahead of us. One of the significant things we did during this time was scale the platform. We onboarded hundreds of teams and subgraphs. During that time, traffic really surged at times. We went from around 5 billion requests at the start of this period per month to something around 100 billion requests a month at the end of this period. So scaling this solution was a significant effort during this time. As we onboarded more teams, we wanted to, we did extend the platform to meet needs of those teams, so that was quite a bit of the activity that we spent, the time that we spent during that period. You know, functionality that wasn't there, capability for both clients and subgraphs. And during this time, that core team that owned most of this really faced success overload. They were buried with work and very, very busy. If some of you are there, you have our sympathy.
Another major focus area for us during this period of platform expansion was to clearly define our best practices and recommendations through a stewardship model. We had established our guild with subject matter experts and GraphQL champions so that they could collaborate and establish standards for the company. We then codified these standards in automated tooling so that subgraph developers could more easily adhere to them. We also established a formalized API review practice so that any changes to the graph were reviewed by GraphQL experts within Indeed. All of these things together definitely helped us establish best practices company-wide, but looking back, I think we've decided that they might not have been quite strong enough. Today, our supergraph is very large and a little unruly, and there are definitely inconsistencies throughout it. And given the speed with which we pushed into the graph during this 2-year platform expansion and how hard it is to scale a single GraphQL expert like Mike, adopting a more formalized governance model earlier probably would have helped us maintain a high-quality supergraph in the end.
As we onboarded more teams and subgraphs, it was obvious to us that it made sense to make investments in developer experience. So one of the things that we did during this time was automated the creation of subgraphs. The idea there being that you sort of get push-button subgraph creation that brings along all of the best practices that we had outlined for teams. We also enhanced our deployment pipeline support. So we did things like made it so when you created a merge request, you'd get an isolated environment that had the supergraph with your subgraph overlaid so you could run integration tests, and that environment would stay living until you actually merged those changes or closed the merge request. We incorporated schema checks so that you'd see any violations as part of the merge request. We incorporated lint rules, so if you see if there were failures, you'd see those on the merge request. And all of this comes pre-configured with observability. So you get, if you use this process, your subgraph has metrics, tracing, logging, and other things reported directly to Datadog automatically. And if you want to learn more about that, Red's here, and we'll be talking later today. She's going to unpack that a little bit and talk about those practices a little bit more in detail.
And then our last focus area during this time was providing training to our developers. We realized that many of our engineers were new to GraphQL during this migration, and we were really asking our devs to think in a very different way than they were used to with REST APIs. So we needed to shift the culture on how we build and use APIs at Indeed. To do this, first, we established company-wide Slack channels so that devs could get on-demand support from other people in the company. This was very easy, and they're still widely used today. And then we also invested in training. We brought in Moon Highway and Apollo speakers to give our teams a more formal introduction to GraphQL and Apollo Federation. And we also hosted several internal workshops to dive deeper into some of the custom approaches that we had built internally within the company. All of these things together, scaling the platform, establishing a stewardship model, investing in developer experience, and providing training, resulted in a strong supergraph ecosystem within Indeed and ultimately led to a successful migration to OneGraph. This is a quote from one of our API developers, and it highlights just that. Our engineers had to learn a new technology, but ultimately they found that the subgraph development experience was simple and the community was strong. And that brings us to December of 2023. At the end of this 2-year migration, our architecture looked like this. The core job seeker and employer experiences and our Glassdoor integration are all powered by OneGraph, and OneGraph itself is composed of about 230 subgraphs, and it served 100 billion requests per month.
Which brings us to earlier this year, where we launched what we called Indeed Plus. Indeed Plus brings our job search and matching capabilities to job boards in Japan. It exposes our APIs so you can post jobs on Indeed, and also enables external developers to basically use our job matching capability as through our APIs. So this was really a big win for Indeed and a big win for job seekers and employers in Japan. And of course, you've seen this picture before. This is how we did that. Our APIs, our subgraphs today sit behind OneGraph. OneGraph serves our internal teams, whether that's on the public internet or internally. It also serves a portion of what Glassdoor does, specifically around job matching, and now serves Indeed Plus, currently just in Japan.
And that finally brings us to today. So earlier this year, we had a major reorg within Indeed, where we merged our job seeker and employer business units into one group, Marketplace as a platform. And now our organization actually better reflects our graph. We've also proven that OneGraph is a reliable way to expose capabilities externally, and we're investing more heavily in our company partnerships. Because of this increasing importance in the investment area, we've also found we need to improve the developer experience for these external partners. There are a couple focus areas for us to do that. First, we want to improve our domain models. We've realized that many of our existing domain models reflect concepts that are internal to Indeed, and we want to update these so they're more in line with industry standard terminology. We also want to provide a little more organization to our graph. Today we have 9,000 types in our graph, which has reintroduced a discoverability problem, but users really only care about a specific slice of a graph we've found. So there are some users that care about our job search and job matching capabilities that are more on the sourcing side, and then we also have users that care about posting jobs, advertising, campaigns, and more on that job management side. And we think we can provide some organization so that they have a better experience interacting with our graph. We're exploring introducing namespacing or introducing new experience-based variants to provide a little more structure around our graph, but exactly how we do this is still up for debate internally. And then the last piece we want to do is implement stronger governance. We want to improve on and preserve the quality and consistency of our graph, and we've realized that we can't do this through stewardship alone. We'd like to introduce more formalized governance with different standards depending on who the end users of a query or mutation are. We really believe that our capabilities that are exposed to our external partners should be the highest quality APIs, but we also want to provide ability for rapid experimentation internally. So that takes us to today. We have learned a lot along the way, so we want to review a couple of our major lessons. First, as is probably obvious by this story, this is a very long and winding road. We started with a microservice architecture split across two major business groups. At different times, we went through periods of bottom-up growth and top-down growth. We've invested in runtime platform, the design of the graph, and in developer experience. And we now have a single large graph, and our two business units have merged into one organization. Throughout this 5-year journey, and largely because of the scope of this migration, it's become clear that classically the only constant is change. So recognize that this takes time, and you should be flexible in your approach and understand where your company and tech stack is at any given time.
And as Nina mentioned, this is a long road, but you have to start somewhere, and don't be afraid to start small. Remember that the employer graph was an intern project. Our initial efforts there were pretty small. We were able to talk leadership into small investments, but these were small teams that started out pursuing problems that aren't near as big as where we landed. During this, we found it important to have our enthusiasts and champions and people involved communicating clearly with leadership what problems they were pursuing and why. This was a really key part of our journey at many points along the way. And last thing I'll say here is don't underestimate what you can get done with stewardship. We need governance today. We needed governance probably sooner, but our graph wouldn't be where it is today without very active stewards who care about the quality of the graph and push quality and standards forward.
And then lastly, be bold. This can be a really big investment, but don't be afraid to go for it. We may never have onboarded Glassdoor onto our APIs if Mike hadn't started Job Seeker Federator 5 years ago, and our SLT team never would have invested in OneGraph if engineers in our organization didn't advocate and demonstrate all the value the technology provides. That said, given this is a big investment, please don't neglect your pitch. Get your engineers excited about learning a new technology and having a better developer experience. Get your leadership excited about reduced duplication, improved stability, and new business opportunities. And then once you pitch, repitch. This is a very long process, so you got to keep the momentum going, and you can do that by celebrating your wins and highlighting your learnings along the way. Be bold, but recognize you need to sell. And to tie things up, I do have one more shameless plug to make. I'll be on a panel later today with some wonderful ladies over here. If you want to hear more about Indeed's journey and what it takes to build a thriving supergraph ecosystem, check it out at 2:30 in Hall 2.
Thank you all for coming.